So our panel discussion today is around the, I guess, the value of crop rotations and cover crops. And so we just quickly run along, and if you could just introduce yourselves and say what you do, that would be a great start.
Good afternoon, everyone. Julie Finnegan from Survag. I lead cover crops and soil health within our organisation. So we've worked a lot in biofumigation for the last 15 years in particular, with more recent focus on looking on other cover crop species that we can work into our rotations, and that's both in annual or horticulture, vegetables, as well as looking into perennial horticultural crops as well.
Hello, yes, I'm Jason McNeil from Premium Fresh, Agriculture Manager at Premium Fresh, so I mainly look after the contract growers and the operations on our farm. But yeah, so we have experience on the farm over the last few years incorporating cover crops into our rotation, and we'll no doubt get some questions in a minute.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tim Walker, lead agronomist for Walker Ag Consultancy. So I've got an independent agricultural consultancy business. Also manage my own farm as well, and yeah, do a bit of agronomy and some trial work here at the research farm.
And I've already had 40 minutes to tell you.
Robert Teague, University of Tasmania.
Thank you. Well, I guess to kick this off, we want to sort of look at, I guess, the benefits of cover cropping, and I guess some comments on the economic benefits, I suppose, of cover cropping with respect to soils. So if anyone would like to comment on that, with how does it weigh up dollar-wise in your cropping rotation, cover cropping?
Yeah, from our perspective, I guess, yes, there's definitely a cost to incorporate cover cropping into the rotation, but we're pretty certain that it's leading to yield sort of increases or quality differences, particularly with our carrots. Like we're finding that it's really noticeable in our crops. The other thing, I suppose, we've sort of combined the cover cropping with things like producing silage in between in the crops, so you can actually sort of recover the cost of the actual initial outlay and still get a lot of the benefits from the additional root growth and things through that winter period. We get protection from erosion and yeah, just provided we manage the weeds properly within in those crops. So we're not really noticing any big issues there. If anything, it's probably allowing us to focus more on weed management in the off-season. A couple of comments.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I look after a few Premium Fresh crops, and I've really noticed the difference, especially following Caliente. The soil structure seems to be better. We will do one or two less herbicides on, seem to get a better weed control. We've been growing and trying different things at home before our potatoes. Tillage radish is a nice, cheap crop you can put in over the winter time, where you can graze it lightly with sheep if you like, or just let it grow up. It's one of those ones you get the benefit of not only freeing up your soil a bit, but the tillage radish bulb is bringing up the nutrients close to the surface as well, and we're finding we're just mulching it and then ripping and then hoeing the ground afterwards. It's coming up really well. It's not proving to be much of an issue at all. Lupins is another good one, not only for the nitrogen content in it, but yeah, just a better soil structure afterwards. So these things yes, they might cost a little bit more, but in terms of holding the soil together as well through a wet winter, it's far better off to have a crop in there than just bare fallow ground to help with erosion and things like that. But there's so many benefits without a great deal of cost. And I think it's becoming more of a practice, and we're seeing the increased results in yield afterwards as well.
Well, you've seen my limited experience of cover crops so far, so I haven't got much more to add to that, except that I sort of pose a question really to everyone else in that some of the cover crops sold, certainly in the UK, by certain companies, are pretty expensive, and they involve all sorts of different mixtures. How do we really know which mixtures are going to be worth paying that money? In fact, I haven't actually met a farmer yet who's ever bought any of these things. They seem to mostly find their own components of cover crops to put together. But how much are the different cover crops worth what we're paying for them, and how do we actually design them anyway, which we can maybe come back to later on. But what are the different components doing? There's actually, looking at it from what they're supposed to be doing, there's almost competing things from the different components. And I wonder how we should actually progress from here to work out which is really delivering in terms of yield, in terms of soil health, and how do we actually assess that. So sorry, I didn't actually answer a question there. I posed a load of questions.
I just had a comment to make about, I work in the potato area quite a lot, and we're seeing a lot of potato growers utilising specific cover crops, traditionally using ryegrass and that type of thing, but replacing that with caliente. A lot of the potato growers have a mixed cropping or a mixed system where they have beef and that type of thing as well. So one of the benefits they see is if they plant caliente, they're not actually tempted to graze that over the winter period because you can't actually graze it. So that's one of the benefits of the biofumigants that potato growers are using.
To answer Sue's original question too, going back to the costs involved, etc., quite often when we're planting cover crops, it takes more than one season to really see the benefits or to be able to measure things that well. So cumulatively, the more we manage our soil with cover crops, the better, or the longer term we'll see those benefits. Very hard to measure. I know RMCG have tried putting figures to improvements in soil health, and it's one of those things that you've really got to be walking your paddocks to see those changes over time. When we also talk about the cover crops and the types that we put in, it's really important to look at what you want to achieve and choose your cover crop accordingly in terms of what you want to achieve. Do you want to look at nematode control? Do you want to start fixing nitrogen? Do you want to look at compaction? Do you have pathogens that you want to control? They are all questions that are really, really important to make sure that you spend your money on the right cover crop. And then when we start looking at the likes of the biofumigants again, it's really important to say, well, what am I trying to control? As Robert was saying, the likes of caliente or a lot of brassicas, they host clubroot. So if you have other brassicas in your rotation, you really want to avoid planting the caliente, for instance, or other mustards. But there are other varieties that could potentially assist in that area. So the likes of oilseed radish, that has a different set of glucosinolates, and it is more resistant to the likes of clubroot. So it might be a better option to put in your system. If you have nematodes that are an issue in your crops, that's where we start looking at the varieties like Nemat. So it produces root exudates that are very specific to attracting pest nematodes within those root systems, and you get a double effect in terms of helping to suppress their reproduction while you're growing the crop, but you also get the added benefit of the release of the ITCs, which will help then kill off those pests as well. So really important to think about what your issue is and what cover crop that you might put in the system to help manage those specific issues.
The other aspect too is the machinery you have available to incorporate the cover crop. A lot of the cover crops for the biofumigant need to be incorporated straight away, so being able to mulch the crop and incorporate it quickly is important. In the fine mulch, yeah. So I guess from our perspective, we've only really focused on the Nemac and Caliente for the carrots. The rest of it is around soil structure, just trying to, I guess, hold the soil together and do as much as we can to create that tilth or that aggregation again. So,
I guess, there's all different types of cover crops, like we've said, and there's different situations. Like say, it might be a nematode, and now we haven't got Nemacure and things like that, which we used to have to control it. The mustard seems to be doing a really good job with that. Like say, you wouldn't do that before a brassica crop. Like even ryegrass in a season like we've just had has been really good for holding soil together in steeper paddocks. You've got the option of then making it for silage as well, so you're getting a bit of income off it. You've still got that really good root structure in the soil, but I guess what's important to remember that you're removing X amount of dry tonnes and nutrients from the paddock that will need to be replaced after result of the soil test or whatever for next crop. So you don't have to look at it as being an expensive operation. It can be part of your farming practice. There's so many different things we can do now. So yeah.
But the only thing, what you're saying about specific crops for specific objectives, I think is really important. And say we found, say, the brassica in that particular circumstances was delivering. But again, it is probably throwing out a question which we haven't got the answer to. But a lot of people keep telling me you've got to go complex on these cover crops. So 8 components, 12, 20 components, things like this. And although I in many ways buy into diversity actually delivers in a lot of ways, the concept at that stage worries me because I see things actually working against each other. So you'll have components which are mycorrhizal, some which are not, some which are producing biofumigants. They'll allelopathic effects, effectively, so they're probably going to knock out other components. And I wonder if designing them, do we know the basic rules when it comes to putting several things together? Again, you've got to bring in why are you doing it, but have you always got to do that? So, or have you always got to say, right, I need to do this at the moment, therefore I need these 5 components, and if I just go for complexity, I'm going to deliver a lesser result. Do we actually have the understanding or the tools to be able to do that for our given circumstances? I'm going to answer that question, but that's sort of how I would, if I had to choose a cover crop for these circumstances, I would worry about just going to somebody's at least 20 once, it's going to solve all problems. I want to really know what's going to be in there and will they work together? Will they actually deliver together? Or will they actually almost cancel each other out on various things? So I think understanding the mechanisms, yes, we understand some things. I think we probably need to look at interactions in particular to deliver on several agendas at once with cover crops.
I see some hands itching here. You want to ask a question of the panel?
Yes, I have to look at this from a forester's point of view and holistic management, and so biodiversity, both in flora and fauna. So separating livestock management away from cropping is maybe a big issue. And so integrated management and restorative agriculture, I haven't heard that term restorative agriculture yet. And I was waiting for that to come, so I mentioned it. So a systems approach I heard from you a number of times, and I think that's where the fear could be removed of saying, oh, if we've got too much diversity, it might trigger something else. But we are where are the trees, for example, on the farm? They were clear. This was forest here. It hasn't been for quite a while, but there are hardly any trees. We can hear the wind whistle through it. How much loss do we get from erosion? How much loss from wind erosion, sunbaking, etc.? So my question is, where are you people in the field and in the research, nationally and internationally, and here in Tasmania? When are we going to have this discussion about complex management?
I'll just cast our minds back to 15, 20 years ago when land care was in full throes, and well before we had GIS and a lot of technology to help us with our mapping. But I know there was a lot of funding, a lot of federal funding that went into whole farm planning. And I think when we're managing our soils, you're dead right, Frank, we still need to be looking at that holistically and planning on how we manage our soils within our own properties, so that we can incorporate the likes of windbreaks or drainage or whatever more sustainably. So I think this seems to be evolving at a really fast rate in terms of mixed covers. 15, 18 different species, people are saying that's the way to go. I'm sort of at the stage where we say we tread very carefully. We look at putting together mixtures that we know work well, that we know won't potentially host a disease for the following crop. We're taking baby steps, and I think as worldwide, this whole cover crop, regenerative ag, restorative ag is moving along really, really quickly. So I just feel we've got so much more to learn, and I think we need to look probably more at our natural systems. But I know Robin Tate, when she came back from her Nuffield Scholarship, found that throughout her travels, the importance of livestock in the rotation was very, very important as well. So I think we've got a lot to learn, and it's a matter of what we can have within our systems.
Yeah, it's good to hear somebody say, restorative, I used to say regenerative agriculture, but particularly regenerative soils in terms of the farming community in Scotland. There's certain groups of them who are very much, there is a regenerative soils group, actually, which is even supported by Scottish Government in a vague sort of way. This is a concept which probably a lot of the farmers are ahead of the researchers on. We, as an institute, are actively talking. I've got a discussion online next week with various people about bringing animals into our system, because if you look at our agriculture in the east of Scotland, we have separated out all the livestock from the cropping. And there's just so much you could potentially do by putting them back together. And so I think that's a really important agenda, and we're already arguing. I've got a lot of people who don't want us to go in that direction, but that's coming from a sort of scientist, maybe reductionist type way of looking at things. Yeah, there's amongst scientists, there's a big problem with systems thinking versus reductionist thinking, I think, and we've really got to make sure that we respect both, because they both are important. And when it comes to systems, we have an agroforestry set up which we haven't been using for the last 20 or 30 years in one of our farms, but we're actively now thinking, hang on, we should be with everyone else or ahead of the agenda on this. So I think now is definitely the time to think about all these things and bring them together. And I think now we're getting tools to look at how complex systems work as well, which will help improve how we develop them. So absolutely, I'm with that sort of approach, and I probably have moved in that direction throughout my career, which is why I'm now working on this sort of thing rather than just on one pathogen and one crop, which is where I started.
This may be a question for Callum, if he's still around, but Julie, do you know if if there's any work done on those longer term resistant spores from like onion white rot or the powdery scab biofumigants able to have any impact on those resistant spores in the soil?
I'll put this down if you like. With regard to the work that we've done, we don't have all the scientific measurement that the likes of TIA have employed, but we have found some reductions in the presence of the likes of powdery scab and so forth when we've had a biofumigant within the system. So we have seen reductions, but I think the thing that's really important to consider when we're saying, will the biofumigants work, is we need to look at how it's grown. Has the agronomy been well placed? The likes of pH can make a big difference as to whether we get a good release of ITCs or other products. The amount of leaf matter, because we know that the leaves are where we get most of the glucosinolate production. The fineness of the maceration is very important because the glucosinolates and the enzyme grow within the plant in their own separate cells. So if we're just cutting up the biofumigants, we don't get that blending of the enzyme and the glucosinolate. So a very fine maceration needs to smash both of those up, hydrolyse and produce your ITCs. And again, the timing, making sure we get it in the ground very quickly. So we can be very quick to say it does or it doesn't work, but it can be very specific in terms of the site as well. The soil type makes a big difference. So under a sandy soil, we're likely to get a greater ITC benefit on suppression compared to a clay soil where it might bind more. So it's horses for courses, and again, it's very much looking at each individual system and keep, for growers to keep track of it for themselves as well.
And is that research being done, or is that just things you're observing in the field, or?
Oh, look, I'm actually going to be heading to Switzerland early next year.
Oh, I'm so jealous.
And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this. There's an international symposium on both biocidal and non-biocidal cover crops in Switzerland next year. So it's the first time that they've included non-biocidal crops. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the research, and hopefully I can share that on my return.
Thank you. We've probably got time for one question. Mark? Yep. It's good, give the old lady the exercise.
Mark, work for TIA. One of the things I wondered about, so we had a scientist visit from California a few years ago, and he was looking at cover crops and disease suppression, and he found the best plant for disease suppression was broccoli, and not because it had ITCs in it, but rather it promoted the community of organisms in the soil. So I guess it makes me wonder, are we focusing too much on ITCs? So I presume that they're rather indiscriminate when it comes to killing bacteria, and plants deliberately putting out exudates to feed lots of other organisms that are providing ecosystem services for the plant. So my question is, do we know what's happening to the good guys, and should we be looking at promoting the diversity of organisms in the soil?
Thank you. Okay. There you go.
Good questions there, Mark. We have looked at some of the beneficial organisms as well as the pests and pathogens, and I think what we find is that a general improvement to the soil health by having a cover crop, and i.e. we have focused on the biofumigants, is that you're improving the soil structure, so you're improving the habitat for beneficials, and you tend to get that balance tipped. So by improving soil health, you improve the beneficials versus the pathogens that might be in the soil. So that quite often might be the reason why we have suppression in pathogens more so than any ITCs. When we start talking about ITCs and glucosinolates, the specific ones that we look at for biofumigation form a fraction of all the glucosinolates that are within plants. So yes, there are hundreds and hundreds of different glucosinolates, all producing exudates, all performing different roles. So in terms of when Robert was talking about where they've just been using the Caliente 199, putting in another biofumigant. Within our organisation, we're promoting the NEMAT, arugula, with the 199, and it's producing totally different glucosinolates, in particular for biofumigation, but it also has different root architecture, which are very complementary. So, again, it's a matter of playing with different varieties, and again, really focusing what your need is by having, by choosing that cover crop. So, and even in the world of biofumigants, some varieties that are sold on the market have totally different or lower levels of the same glucosinolates as other varieties. So where years ago we were breeding glucosinolates out of the likes of our canola, these guys are now breeding it into them to maximise it. So, and the level of sensitivity of a lot of pathogens varies considerably as well. So there are some pathogens that are highly sensitive to the likes of cinnagrine or glucoraphanin compared to other pathogens. So it's highly variable.
Earlier I referred to the follow-on crops after various biomass crops, but one of them was oats, and it gave quite an uplift. And I straight away wanted to know, well, that wasn't what I was expecting. What has gone on? Oats are known for their allelopathic effects. So what did it do to the soil microbiology that gave it the same uplift in yield as beans and peas? And I haven't got an answer. But we're now in the era when we can just sequence the hell out of anything. And we're already doing this. I mean, Robert's doing this with some cover crops as well, with Shane at the university in Hobart. We can take the organisms in the rhizosphere and sequence what's there and start looking at what type of organisms, which ones are beneficials, which ones compete, which ones we have never even heard of before and don't know what they do, because that's a lot of what comes out. We tend to be at the situation of drowning under data at the moment and having difficulty in interpreting it because it's a relatively new area. But I think as we learn to do this and we get more rapid methods of sampling and sequencing and dealing with the data, then we'll start going back to the good experimental work, because it all comes down to actually doing good experiments and good sampling to find out what's going on. And then we can look at all these components of cover crops and their combinations and see what's really happening in the soil as a whole, and how do we push it in the sorts of directions that we want. That is not going to happen next year, but it is going to be some of the science that feeds into this over the coming years and will help greatly. I say at the moment we're drowning under data on the few experiments we've got, so we're really learning how to use this sort of thing to then come back to the very practical questions of what do I mix with what to deliver the beneficials and bias against the things we don't want. It's really all about shifting the system in one direction or another. It's never against eliminating something, because you never manage to do that, or promoting just one thing. It's about shifting the balance, and that's where the cover crops can hopefully be really powerfully used. Do you want to add something on what you've been?
Just briefly talking about ITCs, we do need to grow the crop correctly, as Julie says, to maximise levels. We also need to probably think about the time of the year that we grow them. So at the moment we're growing them in winter, mostly in Tasmania. Work coming out of Queensland is indicating that they're getting higher levels of glucosinolate, higher ITC hits when they're growing them in summer. So timing is important. There are some growers in Tasmania, for instance at Table Cape, that might be growing cover crops and biofumigants over the summer period, but you have to obviously water the crop then. So timing as to when we grow those crops is pretty important as well.
Just a comment, I guess you're better to do something than nothing, as long as you're looking at what it's doing for your rotation. You grow it well, And you're in front just to have anything in the ground rather than leaving it fallow. So that's our approach at the moment. Probably the simplest way of considering how to move forward is just to start and just consider what to put in based on your rotation.
Fully agree with that, Jason. And just like we were talking about before, with like tillage and slugs, like zero till, you're sort of helping to fix a problem and you're creating a problem. At the same time, it can be managed. It's same with things like white fringed weevil. If you're growing legume crops, you're going to host that. Well, perhaps if you know you've got a problem, then your oat's a better idea. It's really looking into it. It's not just a case of planting something and it's going to fix everything. Like, you've got access to a lot of great people you can ask. So but like Jason said, doing something is better than doing nothing at all, and I think that is getting out there. There's you're not seeing all these fallow bare paddocks doing nothing now, getting blown away in this wind. It's been quite depressing the last few weeks, seeing some of that nice topsoil up in the air. It's not getting washed away, it's getting blown away. So it's always little 1%ers, I like to call them. If we all do our bit, then we'll make a difference.
No, I just wanted to add to that, seeing Doris walk in the back there, if people are wanting more information on growing cover crops and biofumigants, Soil Wealth do have webinars that can be accessed via their webpage. So a lot of information, along with fact sheets, can help people out there if you're interested in following that up.
Thank you very much. Right, well, if you could all put your hands together, please, and thank our panellists.